The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, where information never sleeps. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and joining me is my partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Your hair is looking lovely this morning.
Oh, well, thank you. That's nice, considering it's been rather a chaotic morning with some flooding here at the house. Fun times.
Yeah, the river was up.
Oh,
We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking about a topic that's all over the news. It first came into the scientific nomenclature around 2018 when someone did a study and showed that the AMOC had a very drastic shift around the late 1700s. It literally started to slow immensely, and that was concerning. A few other scientists found out about it, and they said, the AMOC is slowing. Wait a minute. That could be bad news. And then since then, 2023 and 24, I have at least 4 papers up that are all alluding to the fact that the AMOC is going to shut down in the near future. It could be as early as next year, but it's most likely to take around a decade or so.
Maybe 2050.
Which is the same time that the apex of the magnetic excursion. It's kind of weird.
Well, it's really interesting, right? And then if you look historically, you've got AMOC collapses that have occurred many times in the past that coincide with those Dansgaard what is it? Dansgaard
Oeschger. It's
There's
hard
a lot
to say.
of vowels and
Dansgaard
consonants
Oeschger.
in that name. Yeah.
So we're going to get into the Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles a little later, but let's keep it light in the beginning because people have no idea what we're talking about right now. So I'm going to share the screen. Tell me if you can see it. Okay. And I just need to get out of here. All right. So we're looking at an artist depiction of the Atlantic meridional. Meridional means north and south. That's all that means. So this is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And you can see there's a red portion and a blue portion. The red on this map is the surface flow. These are the currents on the surface of the ocean, the warm water currents. The little piece we know about here off of North America, we typically refer to as the Gulf Stream. Mm-hmm. And that Gulf Stream is simply a few hundred miles of the AMOC. And it's just the surface part. Now, the Gulf Stream pushes north, this portion of the AMOC, up into the Labrador Sea and up near Greenland there, where it gets cold because it's cold in the Arctic, and that causes a density shift and the water drops deep. The circulation can drop as deep as 2,000 or 3,000 meters deep. That's the deep ocean. And so the blue currents are deep, cold water ocean currents. And if you take a look, they go all the way around Australia. So the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation actually goes into the Pacific. Yeah. It is, in fact, a circulating current that circumnavigates the whole Earth. And it is the major controller of local climate. It's not CO2 or cow farts.
Yeah. Most notably is that you have warm water going north and cold water going south.
Exactly. And unique stuff happens here off the coast of Africa and India. This is an upwelling area where the water comes from 3,000 meters deep back up to the surface. So it's not only driving monsoons, because it's these warm surface currents that provide the moisture to push these monsoons into India and Africa, but it also is recirculating nutrients in the ocean, bringing up deep water nutrients to the top. It also has a lot to do with the fish cycle in the ocean, where these fish are migrating, breeding, and eating. And so a sudden shift in this would confuse almost all marine life, and it would also confuse all climate systems. Very bad. And so that's why they call the AMOC, and it's based on all the stuff we've researched. How many times have you heard the term tipping point?
I know. It's like it's the favorite term of the century. It seems like ever since Malcolm Gladwell coined
reaching
that
the tipping
term.
point.
Yes, yeah, it's a Malcolm Gladwell coined term, and it appears everywhere. But it is a very useful concept.
Yeah, but you know, we learned this term in geology very early on, tipping point, especially as a paleoclimatologist. We're looking at these graphs, trying to explain on the long-term records what in the world is creating this 105,000 year cycle where the temperature changes 25 C instantly.
Yeah.
What is that? And then your professor says, well, we reached the tipping point. And that's a way to explain something you can't explain.
Right. I mean, the basic idea, right, is that you have a very complex system with a bunch of different variables going on. And then there's, you know, let's say there's a shift in one of those variables, and then over time it builds, right? And then it creates new shifts that are not from the changing variable, but inside the system that are responding to that changing variable. And then eventually you get to this place where the whole thing changes.
Right. And when we look deeper into some of these cycles, specifically the Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, which happen in a periodicity of a few thousand years and are not very regular, they're completely unexplained. But what you'll see, these cycles is a gradual rise in temperature and some demarcation, meaning an instantaneous geologic event which plunges the Earth several degrees C that day.
Yeah.
And no one can explain it. And it keeps happening again and again and again, specifically during the Ice Age. So in the last 2 million years, we've seen these, and it's only the last few million years on Earth we have kind of high resolution dating of stuff. You know, when you get back into hundreds of millions of years, it gets sketchy. We don't have like good sediment cores and stuff like that.
Right.
But these cycles are well known and well documented, the Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles. So first, and it's my supposition that it is the shutdown of these ocean circulations which cause the rapid drop in temperature.
I think that's very clear.
And what they really didn't catch up on here, but they allude to in all the papers, is that I think the tipping point has everything to do with the Beaufort Gyre and the release of fresh water into the Labrador Sea.
Yes.
Because the AMOC has been weak since 1800.
Yeah.
But it's still going.
Yeah.
There is going to be something that happens that shuts it down in an instant. And I think it's that release of water. And I think that's where we'll get to.
Well, and I think a lot of the models are pointing, I mean, all four of the papers point to an influx of fresh water that changes salinity that kind of is what eventually pushes this over the edge. They just don't specifically talk about the Beaufort Gyre. They're
right,
of course,
and they don't talk about. Go ahead.
They're of course typically trying to allude to it's like the melting of the Greenland ice sheet that is the contributing cause here,
which has never melted in millions of years. So there.
Right. But so they're looking, you know, they can see from these models that the likely cause is an influx of fresh water. They're not looking at where the fresh water is coming from. And so it's very easy for them to then claim that it has something to do with anthropogenic global warming, even though this AMOC collapse has happened again and again and again and again and again in the past, thousands of years ago. You know, they're still claiming that it has something to do with us.
The most obvious and well-studied, I think, is going to be the Younger Dryas event, 900 years ago.
Yeah. When
a cometary body or group of comets smashed into the Laurentide ice sheet, sending trillions of tons of fresh water into the ocean, stopping the circulation instantly and sending us back into a very cold period, which lasted about the time frame of a Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle, 1,400 years. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting because, okay, there can definitely be like a very immediate cause, such as what you just described. But like this last paper that I just read that was published in February of 2024 really points to how, even a very slow minor influx of fresh water can eventually lead to the AMOC collapse. They
Right.
were very conservative in their model, and they did not include global warming factors.
Let's not ever conclude anything global warming, okay?
Yes.
So here's the problem. When they first started looking at this, it was easy to find the source of fresh water 12,800 years ago from the ice sheet and a catastrophe. But today they're tiptoeing around. There's no ice up there. There's very little ice, or there's no continental ice. We don't have any continental glaciers up there. It only snows in the winter. So where do you get the water? And it's sitting right in plain sight. The Beaufort Gyre has been building for decades. It hasn't released. It is, I think, estimated to be 300 cubic kilometers of fresh water. And it's in a bubble in the ocean up there. So there is some mechanism that allows it to release. Look on this picture of the AMOC here, right between Greenland and the US here, or North America. There's this big opening, and there's all these islands. The Beaufort Gyre is right over here above Alaska, spinning in this little portion of the Arctic Sea. It extends all the way out to like here. Some mechanism all of a sudden will shift it, and it will flow out and hit this part of the AMOC. Essentially, that would be what shuts it down.
Yeah.
So the AMOC is a system of ocean currents, as we described, that circulates water within the entire Earth, let's say. They're only focusing on this North American part because this is where they're writing the article for. But like we showed you, it circumnavigates the globe.
Yeah.
And just like you said, it brings warm water north and cold water south. And without this, we have a tremendous heat imbalance on Earth, which I find fascinating because it starts to explain a bunch of stuff. Like a lot of people are like, well, how come the continental ice sheet is only up in the North Pole?
Right.
Like, well, we have Antarctica as the same amount of ice as the continental sheet up in the North Pole, and it's always there. So they already have the ice down in the southern pole, even in warm times like now.
Yeah.
But if you shut down the AMOC, the global system only cools the North Pole.
Exactly.
Duh.
And it actually potentially gets, one of these models shows that it actually gets warmer in the southern hemisphere. That doesn't mean all the Antarctic ice is going to melt, but there might be some receding of that.
Yeah, the place that we know it recedes, the West Antarctic ice sheet.
Right.
So we know historically that it is exposed to land there.
Yeah.
But the main Antarctic ice sheet, people don't even understand how gigantic and how thick this ice is.
Right.
It would take like 6,000 years above freezing to melt it.
I'm sorry.
You know what I mean? 6,000 years of continuous heat to melt the sheet.
No, it's probably more than that because I was just, it's a little bit off topic, but I was reading, I think it was an X post from Chris Martz or something. And he was sort of doing some rough calculation and basically concluding that, like, if you wanted to melt the entire North Pole or whatever, it would take like 70,000 years at the rate that we're going right now.
Oh yeah, at the rate
something like that.
Yeah. At the rate that we're going. Yeah, I can believe that.
Yeah,
because there is no climate catastrophe looming on the horizon. If the temperature continues to warm, then it's warmer on Earth and everyone's happier.
Right.
People die from it getting colder 9 times more than it getting warmer. The mainstream media doesn't say that in their article when they're fear-mongering that everyone's burning up and dying from the heat.
Yeah.
They never send you that caveat.
Well, and it adds another layer of hilarity to some degree to some of the language in these papers, right? Because they're talking about, the chaos that will be unleashed on Earth if the AMOC shutdowns. And granted, there's very significant climatic differences that will occur. However, and there, well, we'll get to this, but if that happens, it also means, like we just said, that the Northern Hemisphere is going to get significantly colder and Europe will suffer tremendously in that regard. There's the potential for a temperature drop of like 10 to 15 C, especially in Western Europe. So, the global warmists should be kind of happy about this.
The coast of Norway will drop up to 20 degrees and become essentially uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And so inland in Europe will fare better, but a 10, 12 degree shift to the cold doesn't fare very well.
No.
So you'll have mass starvation and stuff like that. Plus, and we'll get to some of the effects globally, it's going to cut down on the monsoons and there'll be starvation and famines elsewhere.
Yeah.
So the question is the AMOC really slowing down? Yes. Yes, it is. And not like the day after tomorrow. So even if you were to stop the AMOC today, in 13 minutes, the Statue of Liberty isn't going to be stuck in an iceberg like the movie. There also probably wouldn't be category 12 hurricanes or whatever the stupid thing they said in the movie was. Like these Cat 12 hurricanes here in Manhattan.
Right. Tornadoes.
Those are not part of it. But do I have the paper up? No. I think we'll get to it. So about a year ago, this article came out in The Guardian. The Gulf Stream could collapse as early as 2025, a study says. And here's the study. Warning of a forthcoming collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And it was in Nature Communications, so huge publication. And this gets almost all the scientists' eyes on the topic right here. This is the paper that got them on there. And so since then, we've had multiple groups around the world coming out with new research. A lot of it's machine learning, and they're using models which are getting muddied up with CMIP5 and global warming gobbledygook.
Yes.
So it's very confusing to even dip your toe into these papers because it's a mishmash of science and scientism woven together.
You didn't show it, but the 2024 paper in Science Advances is this one. Yeah. Much less muddy in my opinion. And if I read it correctly, they largely eliminated the so-called anthropogenic global warming variables when they did their sort of more physics-based model, which I really appreciate because it simplified things. And this is the paper that also shows that even a small, minor influx of fresh water eventually helps contribute to this AMOC collapse.
Yeah, and it's a regular occurrence, I believe. It probably happens thousands of times each glacial cycle.
Yeah.
And it's more likely to occur during the glacial cycle. And we'll see that. It usually doesn't happen during the interstadial because the interstadial is the interstadial because the AMOC is flowing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been strong for 10,000 years, which is why we're proliferating on Earth and we've got farming everywhere and all that. But when we dip back down into the glacial cycle, it's like the AMOC turns on and off every few thousand years. It's literal chaos.
Yeah, which should tell us that we're reaching the end of the interstadial.
Yeah, and so it's those periods of chaos that allow the ice to build up in the north. Each time it shuts down, more ice builds. It may warm up for 1,000 years, but it shuts down again and more ice builds, and it goes on and on.
Well, and it really helps explain too this pattern that we see all the time where the temperature is kind of like rising and rising over a period of time, and then all of a sudden it just gets cold. Because again, it's a tipping point.
Right.
And
let's read this abstract here and bring you up to speed on the first paper to come out, warning of the AMOC shutdown. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, is a major tipping element in the climate system, and a future collapse would have severe impacts on the climate in the North Atlantic region. In recent years, weakening in circulation has been reported, but assessments by the IPCC based on the climate model, CMIP, suggests that a full collapse is unlikely within the 21st century. So based on this, it's funny, abstract, you want to disregard the position of the IPCC because they're the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. And so in the introduction here, it says, a forthcoming collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is a major concern, as it is one of the most important elements in Earth's climate system. In recent years, model studies and paleoclimatic reconstructions indicate that the strongest abrupt climate fluctuations, the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, are connected to the bimodal nature of the AMOC. So there's a direct connection in the first sentence, in the first paragraph of this paper, with the collapse of the AMOC and Dansgaard-Oeschger events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so let's look at them. So here we are back in glacial max 20, 30,000 years ago, and the glacial period, which extends for 100,000 years here. And each of these blips, again and 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 again, is a Dansgaard-Oeschger cycle. We're looking at 018 here, which is a proxy for temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So you can basically say this is a temperature graph.
Yeah.
The lower graph here. And so there's something triggering these every few thousand years. You can see in the beginning of the glacial cycle, they're further apart and they get closer and closer the deeper you go. This is glacial maximum. Some put it at 30,000. Some people put it at 28,000. But as we approach that glacial max, the most ice on Earth, they happen all the time.
It's interesting because what this graph looks like is that there is a tipping point in both directions. There's a tipping point towards the, that's not really making a whole lot of sense. But because the AMOC collapses are happening so frequently and so close together, and then suddenly that pattern ends, you know? So like there's something else going on with the frequency of the AMOC collapsing, where at a certain point, it's like the ice is building and building and building and building, and then something else happens, and then there's a tipping point, and then it stops, right? Because we haven't had an AMOC collapse in like 12,000 years.
Right, because of the interstadial. You can see how constant the temperature is up here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we may be about to have one.
Yes.
Which means the ice age is beginning.
Yes.
That's not in any of the papers.
No.
Wonder why that is.
I gotta bring this up because it really made me crack up. Because okay, the article from The Guardian about this paper is absolutely hilarious, right? Because of the way that they're trying to blame it on anthropogenic global warming, right? So they say at one point they acknowledge the fact that the AMOC has not been shut off for 12,000 years. And then they write, the AMOC collapsed and restarted repeatedly in the cycle of ice ages that occurred from 115,000 to 12,000 years ago, the graph we were just looking at.
Yeah.
It's like, so how are you blaming it on anthropogenic global warming then? And then it's worse, right? Because then like at the end of the article, they say, the analysis is based on greenhouse gas emissions rising as they have done to date. If emissions do start to fall as intended by current climate policies, then the world would have more time to try to keep global temperature below the AMOC tipping point. Like,
how do they know the AMOC tipping point temperature?
Right. But also, given that this has happened repeatedly in the past,
when the temperature
what in the world could greenhouse
when the temperature was 15 degrees C colder on Earth?
Right. What are you talking about?
So the AMOC collapsed 100 times during the Ice Age when it was 15 degrees colder, but now it's collapsing because it's warmer.
Right.
It's our fault.
It's kind of hilarious because it's so simplistic, right? Like the only thing that these people are thinking about is temperature. Obviously, if the AMOC can collapse during an ice age, as well as during an interstadial, there are many other variables at play here that are contributing to this collapse that we surely don't fully understand. And yet they're sitting here going, oh, it's about temperature, it's about temperature. And even though that doesn't make any sense for the reason you just stated, it's so simplistic. It's like a kindergartner writing this article.
Well, you don't have much to go on, just the scientism of global warming, and you got to weave that into the science.
Right. Right. Because there's your funding.
All right. So if DansgaardOeschger events correlate to AMOC shutdowns, there have been 25 AMOC shutdowns during the last glacial period, which is the last 100,000-year glacial cycle. We've had several of these, and so they probably occur each cycle.
Yeah.
But they only talk about the last 100,000 years for some reason.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a reason for that. Apparently, I was reading that we just don't really have the data to talk about time periods before that, right? There's a limit to how much we get out of the Greenland ice cores.
Oh, yeah,
that's
exactly.
Really,
so
that's the limiting
Greenland
factor.
ice core goes back to the Eemian interglacial.
Yeah.
Which was much warmer than today.
Yeah.
And so that's the high resolution ice. It's only 115,000 years.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But it's continuous and pristine. Okay, so think about it. All the catastrophists on YouTube claiming that Greenland was at the equator, complete nonsense.
Yeah. Yes. Because of that continuous, nothing melted and fell apart.
And even in the warmest time on Earth, now the interstadial, there are planes that crashed on the Greenland ice sheet 50 years ago that they've located. They're under hundreds of feet of ice. Yeah. That's how much ice accumulates during the warmest time on Earth on Greenland.
Right. And that's modern times. You know?
But the articles say Greenland is melting. It's disappearing. So how does the plane get under 200 feet of ice if Greenland is melting?
Right. How are we not building ice?
Oh, dear.
Well, and of course, as we've discussed many times too, the existence of frozen mammoths, for example, is the key indicator that nothing has melted, period, in a very, very, very long time.
Right. There's pristine permafrost in the Arctic that's over 2 million years old.
Mm-hmm. And it's not like it melted and refroze, right? No. Because then those specimens would be degraded.
Right. They've recovered DNA. The DNA couldn't be there unless it was frozen the entire time.
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about the effects. The effects of these Dansgaard-Oeschger effects, they change the temperature 5 to 8 C over a period of just a few decades. So that is massive. And no, Manhattan doesn't freeze over like the movie.
Right.
Which some of these catastrophists are claiming. The AMOC shuts down, the day after tomorrow is going to happen. Absolutely insane. Yep. So what does happen? Well, let's start with the Indian summer monsoon. If the AMOC shuts down, it will impact on wind flow, and an AMOC collapse may hurt the establishment of the monsoon in India. Mm-hmm. In the Sahel, in Western Africa, in the monsoon, it will have an impact on wind flow there. And the intertropical convergence zone, by AMOC collapse, it may hurt the establishment of the monsoon in Africa. Mm-hmm. It may even dry out the Amazon rainforest.
Yes. But you know what?
Yeah.
Climate always changes.
Yeah.
This is a normal part of Earth's cycle.
Yeah. And guess what happened? Guess what Northern Africa looked like 11,000 years ago?
Green.
It was green. Yeah. So things always change.
Yeah.
And none of it is your fault.
Yeah. Yeah. The Science Advances paper presents some sort of specifics about changes that they see in their modeling. For example, the European climate.
Science Advances, the one. Okay, here it is. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And this happens relatively quickly, right? So they have a model and they're using a period of years. So I'm not talking about the year, I'm talking about model years. So sometime between model year 1750 and 1850, and again, this is the paper that uses a very small influx of fresh water. They're talking about temperatures in Europe dropping by 5 to 15 C. That's really significant.
Yeah. What the
And
heck?
where was that other?
Yeah, so the model shows here, looks exactly like what I saw on the model run. If the AMOC shuts down, this is the most severely affected right here off of the western tip of Norway is where
Yeah.
the cold bullseye is.
Yeah.
But also here on the graph, you can see how something happened in 1800 and the AMOC just shuts down in a period of 50 years.
It's very abrupt the way it's described here. I'm trying to find that. I mean, they also do talk about what we were just talking about, the ITCZ zones, the, wet seasons becoming dry seasons and vice versa.
Yeah.
Okay, here. So they say, okay, so when the AMOC starts to weaken in their model during the first 400 years, it doesn't change much. There's the sort of regular natural variability. But then after model year 800, you start seeing big changes. And then after 1750, that's when you find this very abrupt collapse. That's what we're looking at here in this graph C there.
But it's stabilized. It's stabilized in modern times.
Yeah, and then they say it so the strength of the AMOC, so that I don't know what this unit is. They use a unit called Sverdrups. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Sverdrups. So it's we start it at 1750. The strength of the AMOC is about 10 Sverdrups, and then it decreases to 2 Sverdrups 100 years later. So that's 1850, and then it becomes slightly negative after model year 2000. So that's kind of that stabilization that you're starting to see in that graph.
Now, here's the problem. Just because it's stabilized doesn't mean we're safe. That's the problem.
No.
It's dropped to such a low level that we are at a threshold where something happens, it stops. And that's the bad news.
Well, and I mean, obviously, any severe climactic shift is going to cause chaos for humans and all biological life on Earth. But this is part of how things work on Earth. Things change. The climate always changes. It's just that we happen to be living in a time where we're starting to see the beginnings of that.
Yeah, what a time to be alive.
And I've said this so many times, but part of the problem that human beings have is that we're dependent on these global systems that you can't just abruptly change, right? Like the example I always like to use is monoculture agriculture. We have these giant agricultural operations that you just can't pick up and move somewhere else. If our agriculture was regionally and locally based, we could adapt a lot more easily, but we don't have that. And then we have 8 billion people who are dependent on that global system. So, I think animals may actually fare better in this. I don't think it's going to be easier for them, but it's going to be horrible for human beings.
Yeah, because we're lazy and inept.
Yeah. And most people don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to grow food. And I mean, this is disastrous.
And it happens very rapidly.
Yeah.
And it's happening potentially now. I think that a release of the Beaufort gyre is the nail in the coffin.
Yeah. Well, and even if that's already happening, but at a very slow pace, let's say, just drips and drabs of that releasing, that would be part of this process that's causing the AMOC to weaken now.
Well, you can see how some of this fresh water escapes out here every year. So it is, but the Beaufort gyre is spinning right in here. And this is where under the ice is fresh water accumulating. It gets stuck in an eddy here. And at some point it will follow this and come out, or see how it comes down in through here?
Yeah.
It is going to release in one of these two places. They don't know how it does it. They know it's done it before. Yeah. And the bad news is that it's now been building for a very long time, much longer, and it has much more fresh water than ever before. And if it were to release, it would probably immediately shut down the AMOC.
Yeah. Well, I think it is releasing, but like I said, just at a slow pace. And
it's leaking, but it's also building. It's doing both.
Right. Yeah. Right. And maybe the AMOC collapse itself, the low strength of the AMOC, that may help the release, right? Because you're now not, you're pushing less and less water up north, which might sort of stop some of that release.
Yeah,
But
it's
now
slowed
there's
down by
less
like
of a push.
the volume of the AMOC has been transport. The water transport has been reduced by 75%.
Yeah, right.
And this is a slow flow. It's not like moving rapidly. If I was a piece of water here in the Azores, I was on a boat and I could take it through the AMOC, it would take over 1,000 years to get back to the start.
Oh,
That's
wow.
how slow this flow is.
Wow, that's interesting.
So it's very easy to stop a conveyor belt that's moving that slow.
Yeah.
It takes 1,000 years to traverse all the way back to the starting point.
That's amazing.
Well, it shows you how the planet is alive.
Yeah.
Literally.
It's breathing.
Yeah, this is more like it's the circulatory system, right? The veins.
Yeah.
And so we haven't witnessed anything like this. This is funny. I'm watching some symposia presentations on this. All the people are super global warmists. The talks are terrible. And they're saying things like, we are affecting the temperature. The temperature is rising faster than at any time in geologic history.
No,
Just
that's not true
the
at all.
dumbest things coming out of their mouths.
It's so easy to disprove. It's like, I mean, I've said this many times before, but I just don't understand the lack of due diligence, the failure to just simply look at a temperature graph in geological time. All you have to do is look at that and see that we've had temperature rises again and again and again and again. It's like, and that this is no different than what we've seen in the past. It's just mind-boggling to me, because it just takes the smallest amount of investigation to see that cannot be true.
In the last 150 years, the temperature has gone up 1 degree C.
Right.
During the end of the Younger Dryas, the temperature went up 14 degrees C in the same period.
Right.
You only want to go back to 11,400 years ago when it happened.
Yeah.
Absolute
so, I mean, this is where
absurdity.
I mean, this is where I start harping on intellectual dishonesty, because that's really what's happening here. The amount of ignorance is just based out of pure laziness, and I suppose being brainwashed, and perhaps the being brainwashed leads you to never look at the temperature graphs of the past or come up with some ridiculous rationalization as to why we've had major temperature rises before.
Well, and it's almost hilarious because the AMOC is going to shut down. It always does. And it starts again.
But if only we reduce our greenhouse gases, we might be able to stop it from happening.
What I'm saying is that the brainwashed masses, when this shuts down, they're going to understand what climate change is.
Right. And I guess they'll think that it's all our fault. I mean, that's the other thing that's hilarious about this to me is, like, okay, the idea that human beings can somehow outpace the power of this freaking sun. You know, just look at a picture of the size of the Earth next to the sun, and then put a human being in there. Just like by size comparison alone, the idea that we can somehow outpower the sun is so ridiculous to me. And this is no different. That we somehow have the ability to stop this AMOC collapse, even though it's happened thousands of times in the geological past before.
If we just cut emissions enough.
We don't even understand all of how all of the variables play together to make this happen. We're just investigating that now. So, like, why would some random little thing we did, reduce our greenhouse gases, why would that stop this process?
Wait, you don't understand how if we make more Teslas, that will save the AMOC?
Save the AMOC, right? Watch, that becomes like the next slogan. It's like it's like saving the whales. Save the AMOC.
Right. Global warming, though, will cause global cooling. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
So they should be happy about this. They should want the AMOC to shut down, for goodness sakes.
That's what I was saying in the beginning. It's going to get a lot colder in the northern hemisphere once this thing collapses. Aren't the global warmists happy about that?
Isn't this their goal?
Right. But this is where you get into the whole, oh, it's not, this is how we went from the shift from the term global warming, anthropogenic global warming, to just climate change, right? Because at some point it became very clear that climatic change means all kinds of things, which does happen. As we just said 16 times, the climate always changes. And yes, there will be chaos on Earth, and it is bad for human beings. And it's bad for all of the other species on the planet. But guess what? We're not stopping it. That's not going to happen. So let's just be realistic about the fact that the Earth is not the same all the time.
We could install giant fans and push the warm water north. I'm sure there's going to be $1 billion startup that does that.
There will be a Bill Gates plan of some sort, right? It's funny to me that every cockamamie plan that comes out of Bill Gates' mouth, right? Like injecting aerosols into the sky to stop global warming, cutting down trees to sequester carbon. All of the things that he suggests will simply make the inevitable Earth changes worse. And this is part of why I really think that part of the goal here for the global elitists is to, act as if they're doing things to stop anthropogenic climate change. And then when it does inevitably change, they can say, oh, see, look, we fixed it. But in reality, they're actually going to make it worse.
Unfortunately, I think it's more nefarious than that. The way that they're trying to corporatize food, for instance, they want to shut down all farming and they want everything to be pumped out of a factory. Now, think about that. What happens when a solar flare takes out the grid? Food cannot be produced anymore and everyone dies.
Well, and it's worse than that, because the food that, let's say the lab-grown meat that's being pushed and is starting to hit the market now, and we don't even know if it's going to be labeled as such. I mean, that stuff, I can't believe that meat grown in a vat would actually be healthy, right? Like none of this food is going to be healthy. It's all going to be toxic, like the Impossible burgers that are super processed and all of the seed oils that we're eating.
Ultra processed is what it's called.
Ultra processed.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why no one buys it in Pagosa. The Beyond Meat section went from 4 feet wide to 2 feet wide to a square foot, and now they're going to just probably eliminate it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only saving grace, is that the market pressure is such that most people aren't interested in any of these things. But, you can force this issue, right? Like you can start claiming that everybody has to kill their chickens and raise meat prices to levels that make it impossible to buy it, which at the end of the day is only going to make human beings sicker. I mean, at this point, I'm completely convinced that animal meat and fat is absolutely essential to human health because it contains loads of micronutrients, and the just the way that the not eating meat thing is being pushed is, to me, a huge indicator of how nefarious all of this is.
Yeah, it was the process of learning how to cook meat over a fire that allowed our brains to grow and to get us here.
Yeah.
So if you stop that practice, you're going to get a huge group of dumb humans.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but I mean, you've got, certain people who are experimenting on themselves with the carnivore diet. I'll give one example. Jordan Peterson's daughter, Michaela Peterson, who
that's a good one,
has suffered tremendously throughout her life with crazy autoimmune diseases, has been on all kinds of pharmaceutical drugs trying to fix this, eventually got off of all of that stuff, went on a pure carnivore diet. I believe she was only eating lamb for some period of time, but I think still is completely carnivore, and completely cured herself of all of her health problems, and she's perfectly healthy. We've had this line in for just about my entire life, we've been hearing about how saturated fat from animals is bad for you and too much meat is bad for you and blah, 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 blah. And actually it's quite the opposite.
It's the opposite.
And I'm not saying that vegetables are bad, because I think vegetables are great, but like the rest of the crap that we're eating, seed oils and huge amounts of carbohydrates, which lead a lot of people to insulin resistance, including myself. all of those insulin resistance is contributing to in huge ways to all kinds of other diseases, including things like dementia. Right. So all of the
Alzheimer's was created through the FDA when they claimed in the 50s that cholesterol was bad. They developed drugs to reduce cholesterol, and then people started getting dementia because your brain is protected by a layer of cholesterol.
Right. You need more cholesterol as you age. You also need cholesterol when you're younger because it's the basis of all of your sex hormones. The cholesterol numbers that are now considered normal are far, far lower than they used to be. And I just saw some data yesterday, showing that the people who have extremely low cholesterol perfectly correlate to an increased rate of mortality, and it's very significant. So all of these people who are on statins with like cholesterol levels of like 150 or whatever, those people are in serious danger. Yeah. Wow, we went a long way from anthropogenic global warming BS to
all these take us back to the same issue, the globalist issue, and where the world is headed. It's headed in a terrible place.
Yes. Yes. Keep eating meat.
Cook it in butter.
Yeah. I now cook my eggs in beef tallow every morning. It's fantastic. Grass-fed beef tallow, just for y'all, is loaded with vitamins. Any grass-fed ruminant fat is loaded with vitamins.
All right, let's go back on topic. What happens when you shut down the AMOC? Like, what happens? The oceans go stagnant? There still has to be flow due to wind, and there's going to be mixing. But I think what doesn't happen is you start to get an ocean that's more layered, where it stays extremely cold down low, becomes more anoxic because it's not getting refreshed. And so what I think that would mean is that coastal waters would in fact become warmer in the summer.
Yeah.
Like a puddle.
Yeah.
Less circulation. Right. And that freezing cold Pacific water in California might warm up a little bit.
Yeah. Can you imagine? That would be interesting. Because if you've ever been in that water, it's really, really cold.
Yeah. You're just like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then of course we would have, as we sort of already discussed, but the Amazon rainforest would likely start drying out, and the Sahara would likely start getting wetter. I'm not clear on what the exact effects on the Indian monsoons would be, but I assume that would mean that the monsoon would be less. And that's really detrimental because you've got
it could be non-existent because there's no flow, so you're not going to get that seasonal moisture move over there.
Yeah, yeah. And that's detrimental because you've got millions of people who depend on those monsoons. Same thing in Africa. So that's pretty devastating. And as we also discussed, Europe would get significantly colder. I'm guessing that North America would also get significantly colder.
Colder and stormier.
Yeah. Well, it just sort of made me wonder, like, okay, so for example, here in the Rockies, we have a monsoon every year. It's not like, at the level of an Indian monsoon, although the last couple of days might suggest differently because we just got hammered with rain, which caused flooding here. But yeah, I wonder, how would
everywhere there were evacuations in New Mexico. It was insane yesterday.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure
all over the Four Corners was inundated. The flash flooding footage on Twitter is crazy.
Oh man. I was like laying in bed last night with the window open and I can hear the river is raging. It's so loud. And I'm sitting there going, oh man, this is going to flood. And lo and behold, it did. And I'm sure we've got lots of other people in our river valley who have suffered from that as well.
All right, so prepare yourself, kids. There's no immediate worry. If the AMOC were to collapse today, it's not going to change your life in any way. It will take a period of time before the effects are felt. It's going to get very cold in Europe very quick.
It's in process, though. I mean,
yes.
So that's another thing we haven't talked about is the estimations of when this might occur, right? So darn it, I wish I could remember it. One is sometime between 2025 and 2095, right? So the mean is about 2050 or so. I'm reading elsewhere that that's pretty consistent. I think the other models would predict the likely collapse would be a bit earlier than that. Like maybe.
Well, this says the classical EWS are based on critical slowdown. Ditelvsen and Ditelvsen, 2023, estimate the present day AMOC would collapse in the year 2057.
Yeah.
With 2025 and 2095, that time span at the 95% confidence value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everybody else is a wee bit earlier than that, I think. So this one is a window, it's more like between 2040 and 2065.
Now, here's the problem with any of these predictions is they don't know the mechanism to stop it. They say it's fresh water, but if the Beaufort Gyre releases all at once, that means it happens instantly. It's not in any of these papers.
Yeah, that I think is a significant thing to mention.
So the 2025 number is probably based on an amount of fresh water equivalent to Beaufort Gyre coming in there that quick.
Well, okay, but it may account for it in the sense that several of these papers, the 2024 paper in Science Advances, they are the only ones that use a slow influx of fresh water. The other papers use a much stronger influx of fresh water, and one of them is specifically pointing to the change in salinity that really brings on the collapse. So maybe those papers are more muddy because they are using models that include anthropogenic global warming variables, right? They're starting with a model that includes that. So it's a little muddy, but they are talking about much bigger influxes of fresh water. So, I mean, maybe it's somewhere in between, you know?
So if you're young, you may be alive to witness the collapse of the AMOC, which,
I mean, I'm seeing dates as early as like 2037 for not just the range in which it might happen, but the more like the mean period. So, you know, it could be 2040, it could be 15 years from now, and that's not far away.
It could be a year, in my opinion, if the Beaufort Gyre releases. It would happen.
Right.
So it's anyone's guess. It is going to be catastrophic in unexplainable ways. It's not like an asteroid hitting Earth, but it's the equivalent to the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then can you imagine when it actually happens, the global warmists will be like screaming and hollering like, see, we told you, even though this is a natural process. See what the hell that we've unleashed on Earth. We should all just kill ourselves now.
Shut down the AMOC.
Right. I mean, that'll be the push. Like we should just kill ourselves. Yeah, because we're a scourge of the Earth.
It'll be colder. Isn't that what they want?
I know, right? At least in the northern hemisphere, which is where most global warmists are. So, like, are they going to be screaming and hollering for the people in the southern hemisphere that have more heat, or the people who are, well, they will be screaming for the people who are lacking their monsoon because they're already talking about it. But
everyone can move to the southern hemisphere where it's warmer. It's that simple.
If they want to, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, don't move to the tropics because that's probably going to be the most devastating area of all, I would imagine, with wet areas drying out and dry areas getting wet. Yeah. That could be really, really devastating. But also Europe will be devastated by such a significant drop in temperature. Like we've said, more people die from cold than they do from heat. I mean, it just, it makes me wonder too about, like we said, we haven't had an AMOC collapse in 12,000 years, but like, was there a process like this that was like underway, let's say during like the Maunder minimum, or is that completely solar based? What do you think?
Yeah, the Maunder minimum is right here on the graph. So the AMOC, where's the good graph? Yeah, so the Maunder minimum is on here. It was during the AMOC collapse.
But I think this is a model year. It's not it's not the years on the x-axis. It's the years within the model. So
yeah, but
you know,
1750 to 1850 is when they confirm a rapid shutdown of the AMOC.
Right, but it's 1750 within their model. It's not the year 1750.
Yeah, but it is. It translates to actual time. This is based on their. So they're saying in 1750 to 1850, back in the history, this is when this occurred, this shutdown. Even though it's a model, it's representing the actual year. Do you understand?
I'm not sure you're correct, but anyway.
Great show. Ho ho.
Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.